Today is Wednesday, July 22nd, 2026, and today is National Hammock Day, which might be the most relaxing national day on the calendar. It's the only holiday where accomplishing absolutely nothing could be considered celebrating. If someone asks you what your plans are today, you can honestly say, I'm observing a national holiday. And as I work through today's stories, I noticed something interesting. Each of today's stories began with a single moment that nobody realized would become symbolic. One happened outside a movie theater. Another took the place on top of a mountain. And the third started with a small booklet that millions of Americans suddenly had to carry in their pockets. They were ordinary moments that ended up representing something much bigger. Welcome to Wait, That's Random, This Day in History. I'm C.L. Burns, voice actor, audiobook narrator, and someone who apparently spends an unhealthy amount of time wandering through historical rabbit holes so you don't have to. Our first story begins outside a neighborhood movie theater on Chicago's North Side. On July 22, 1934, America's most wanted man walked out of the Biograph Theater and into history. His name was John Dillinger. By the summer of 1934, Dillinger had become the country's most notorious bank robber. Newspapers followed his every move. His daring escapes, brazen robberies, and ability to stay one step ahead of the law enforcement had turned him into something unusual. A criminal and a celebrity. The United States was deep in the Great Depression. Banks had failed, families had lost their savings, and many Americans had little sympathy for financial institutions. While Dillinger's crimes were violent and dangerous, some people viewed him as a rebellious folk hero who embarrassed the very banks they blamed for their hardships. The FBI saw something entirely different. To them, Dillinger represented a growing wave of organized criminals who traveled easily across state lines while local police struggled to keep up. Capturing him became one of the Bureau's highest priorities. Their break came from someone surprisingly close to Dillinger, a Romanian immigrant named Anna Campanos. Better known as the Woman in Red, agreed to tell federal agents where Dillinger would be in exchange for help avoiding deportation. On the evening of July 22nd, Dillinger attended a showing of the gangster film Manhattan Melodrama at Chicago's Biograph Theater. Federal agents quietly surrounded the building and waited. As Dillinger stepped out onto the sidewalk after the movie, agents moved in. Accounts differ about exactly what happened next. The FBI said Dillinger reached for a weapon and attempted to flee into a nearby alley. Witnesses disagreed on some of the details. What isn't disputed is the outcome. Agents opened fire, and John Dillinger died on the sidewalk just outside the theater at the age of 31. Almost immediately, crowds gathered. Newspapers rushed out special editions. Souvenir hunters chipped pieces from the sidewalk and searched for anything connected to the scene. Within hours, Dillinger's death had become one of the biggest news stories in America. I've always found that fascinating because Dillinger's greatest robbery wasn't a bank. It was stealing so much public attention that people remembered the legend almost as much as the crimes themselves. Speaking of moments that became much bigger than anyone expected, our next story begins with one woman standing on a mountaintop more than 14,000 feet high, looking out across America. On July 22, 1893, a college English professor named Catherine Lee Bates climbed to the summit of Pikes Peak in Colorado. The journey itself wasn't easy. There were no paved roads leading to the top. Bates completed much of the trip by prairie wagon before finishing the climb by mule and on foot. When she finally reached the summit, she looked out across the vast plain stretching eastward toward the horizon. The view stopped her in her tracks. Years later, she wrote that she was overwhelmed by what she saw. Mountains fading into endless farmland, amber fields shimmering in the distance, and a landscape so immense it seemed to go on forever. That experience inspired her to write a poem she initially titled Pikes Peak. You probably know it by another name, America the Beautiful. What's interesting is that it wasn't written as a national anthem or even as a patriotic song. It was a personal reflection. Bates had been traveling across the country during a time of enormous economic inequality. While she admired America's natural beauty, she also hoped the country would live up to its highest ideals. That's why the poem doesn't simply celebrate the landscape, it also asks for wisdom, compassion, justice, and grace. A few years later, the words were paired with Samuel A. Ward's hymn, Materna, creating the version we know today. Over the decades, America the Beautiful has become one of the nation's most beloved patriotic songs. In fact, it has occasionally been suggested as an alternative to the Star-Spangled Banner because of its singable melody and hopeful message. I've always appreciated that the song began not with politics, but with wonder. Sometimes the best way to appreciate a country is simply to stand still long enough to really see it. Speaking of seeing the country differently, our final story reminds us that even something as ordinary as filling your gas tank can become part of history. On July 22, 1942, the United States began nationwide gasoline rationing during World War I. At first glance, that might seem a little surprising. The United States wasn't running out of oil. The real problem was rubber. Japanese forces had captured many of the world's largest natural rubber supplies in Southeast Asia, creating a serious shortage for the Allies. Military vehicles needed tires, and replacing worn-out civilian tires became increasingly difficult. The government realized the simplest way to conserve rubber wasn't to ration tires. It was to reduce driving. Beginning in the eastern states and soon expanding nationwide, Americans received ration books filled with coupons. The amount of gasoline a driver could purchase depended on the type of sticker displayed on the windshield. Essential workers, doctors, farmers, and other whose jobs required travel received larger allotments, while most civilians had to make do with far less. Suddenly, every trip mattered. Families combined errands. Carpools became common. Vacations were postponed. Sunday drives became a luxury many simply couldn't afford. The goal wasn't merely to save gasoline. It was to help win the war. Millions of Americans accepted the inconvenience because they understood that every mile they didn't drive helped conserve tires, fuel, and transportation resources needed by the military overseas. I've always found that fascinating because rationing transformed something people rarely thought about into something they carefully planned. It was a daily reminder that ordinary choices could contribute to an extraordinary national effort. And before we wrap up today's stories, today's birthday belongs to Willem Dafoe, who was born on July 22, 1955. Of course, over a career spanning more than 4 decades, Dafoe has become one of the most respected and versatile actors of his generation. Born in Appleton, Wisconsin, he developed an interest in experimental theater before helping found the Wooster Group, an influential New York theater company known for pushing creative boundaries. That willingness to take risks followed him into film, where he built a career unlike almost anyone else in Hollywood. Rather than chasing traditional leading man roles, Dafoe became known for choosing complex, unpredictable characters. Whether portraying Sergeant Elias in Platoon, Vincent Van Gogh in At Eternity's Gate, or Green Goblin in Spider-Man, he has consistently embraced roles that demand intensity, vulnerability, and remarkable range. His work has earned multiple Academy Award nominations and the admiration of directors across every genre, from independent dramas to major blockbuster films. I've always admired Willem Dafoe because he never seemed interested in taking the easy path. Instead, he built a career by choosing interesting characters over predictable ones, proving that longevity often comes from being willing to surprise both audiences and yourself. The more I thought about today's stories, the more I realized they all began with moments that seemed surprisingly ordinary. A man leaving a movie theater. A woman standing on a mountaintop. A family opening a ration book. An actor deciding to pursue unusual roles. None of these moments looked historic at the time. But history often has a way of taking ordinary moments and revealing, years later, just how much they mattered. Anyway, I have a feeling the next time I walk out of a movie theater, I'll glance around for a second and think, well, I'm glad I'm not America's most wanted bank robber. And with that, here's something Willem Dafoe once said that seemed to fit today's story surprisingly well. The only interesting work is work that takes a risk. If you'd like to hear more of my work or see other corners of the internet I've been quietly building things in, you can head over to waitthat'srandom.com. I'm C.L. Burns. thanks for hanging out with me for a few minutes. I'll see you tomorrow.